The snow had been falling for 3 days when Etta Sawyer finally understood that she was not going anywhere. She stood at the frost-laced window of Joseph Hunter's ranch house, watching the drifts pile against the fence posts until only their tops were visible, jagged wooden teeth biting up through a white world that had swallowed every road, every trail, every last hint of the direction she had come from. Her breath fogged the glass. Behind her, she could hear him moving in the kitchen, the clank of the iron pot, the hiss of water meeting a hot surface, and the low, deliberate sounds of a man who was pretending very hard not to be aware that she was still there. It had been an invitation. "Just supper," he had said. "Just stay for supper, Miss Sawyer, and I will have you back to Clover Creek before dark." That had been October. This was January. And somewhere in the 4 months between that quiet evening invitation and this snow-buried morning, everything Etta had been so certain about, her plans, her careful independence, the lockdown architecture of her heart, had been quietly and completely dismantled by a man who did not know how to ask for what he wanted but knew very well how to make a woman feel like she had finally come home. She pressed her fingertips against the cold glass and tried to remember the version of herself who had walked up to this ranch house that October afternoon with nothing but a carpetbag, a letter of introduction, and a borrowed horse. That woman had been composed, purposeful, and absolutely certain that she would not make the mistake her mother had made, which was to let a handsome, quiet man with good land and sad eyes convince her that love was worth the price of everything else. And yet here she was. Still there come spring. To understand how Etta Sawyer came to be standing at Joseph Hunter's window in the middle of a Montana blizzard, her heart doing something she did not have a safe word for, you have to go back to that October afternoon, to the moment when she first rode up the long dirt path to the Hunter spread and saw him standing on the porch. The year was 1878. The town of Clover Creek, Montana Territory, sat in a valley between two ridges of pine-covered mountains, the kind of town that was real enough to have a post office and a school and a church with a proper steeple, but small enough that everybody's business was everybody else's business too. There were about 300 souls in and around Clover Creek, ranchers and miners, and a handful of merchants, a doctor who drank a little too much and a preacher who prayed a little too loud, and a general understanding that the land was hard, the winters were harder, and a person's character was measured primarily by how they behaved when things got difficult. Etta Sawyer had arrived in Clover Creek in September of that year on the twice-weekly stage from Helena, which itself had been an 11-day journey from St. Louis, which had been preceded by 2 weeks of arrangements and goodbyes, and the careful, painful business of closing out the chapter of her life she was leaving behind. She was 26 years old. She had a teaching certificate from the Missouri State Normal School, a modest trunk of practical clothing, a small amount of money saved from 3 years of teaching in St. Louis, and a letter from the Clover Creek School Board offering her the position of schoolteacher at a salary of $32 per month, plus a room in the boarding house run by a widow named Mrs. Adeline Polk. What she did not have was a husband, a prospect, or any interest in acquiring either. This made her something of a curiosity in Clover Creek. Mrs. Polk, who was 61 years old and had opinions about everything, pointed this out to Etta on her very first evening at the boarding house, over a supper of salt pork and cornbread that was better than anything Etta had eaten on the stage. "You are a handsome woman and you are not 20 anymore," Mrs. Polk said, in the manner of a person delivering useful information rather than a criticism. "In a town this size, that means things move fast. You will have callers within the week." "I am here to teach school," Etta said. "You can do both," Mrs. Polk said. "I would prefer to do only the one," Etta said. Mrs. Polk studied her with the shrewd, measuring look of a woman who had seen a great deal of life and survived most of it, and then she said, with unexpected gentleness, "Somebody broke your heart pretty thoroughly back in Missouri, I expect." Etta did not answer that. She did not need to. Mrs. Polk was right that the callers came quickly. By the end of Etta's first week teaching the 16 children of Clover Creek their letters and their sums and a little geography, she had received 2 invitations to Sunday supper and 1 actual written proposal of marriage from a cattle rancher named Gerald Fitch, who was 54 years old and apparently saw no need to work up to things gradually. She declined all of them politely and went on with her work. The work was good. The children were bright and eager, and some of them were funny in the way that children in difficult circumstances often are, quick and clever and old in some ways while remaining heartbreakingly young in others. There was a boy named Tommy Reeves who could do long division in his head, but had never seen a book before coming to school. There was a girl named Clara Jennings who was already reading at a level years beyond her age, and who looked at Etta with a kind of fierce, hungry admiration that made Etta feel the weight of responsibility like a physical thing. Teaching was what Etta was made for. She understood this the way some people understand a calling, not as a decision but as a recognition. Joseph Hunter she heard about before she met him. She heard about him the way you hear about anything in a small town, in pieces and fragments assembled from multiple sources that don't quite agree with each other, but together make a picture. Mrs. Polk mentioned him twice in the first week, once in the context of a dispute over water rights that Etta did not fully follow, and once in the context of a comment about a man who would have been a good match for someone if he ever decided to stop grieving and rejoin the living. The storekeeper, a practical man named Henderson, mentioned that Joseph Hunter was one of the most reliable accounts in the territory, paid his bills on time and did not complain, which Henderson seemed to regard as the highest virtues a man could possess. The blacksmith's wife mentioned that Joseph Hunter had a fine spread, good water, a solid house, and no wife, and looked at Etta meaningfully when she said it. What Etta pieced together was this: Joseph Hunter was 32 years old. He had come to Montana Territory from Tennessee 8 years earlier, which would have been 1870, and had built his ranch from nothing on a piece of land in the valley north of Clover Creek, about 4 miles from town. He ran cattle and some horses. He had a hired man named Rufus who was older and had worked for him since the 2nd year. He had been married once. His wife had died 3 years ago. He had no children. He went to town when he needed to and not otherwise, and he was known to be a fair man, a hard worker, and not much of a talker. The grief Mrs. Polk mentioned was real and visible to anyone who saw him, apparently. He wore it the way some men wore a good coat, with a kind of quiet dignity that somehow made it worse. Etta told herself this information was merely the natural accumulation of living in a small town where people talked. She was not cataloging Joseph Hunter in any particular way. She was simply a person who paid attention. She met him on a Friday afternoon in early October when she came out of Henderson's general store carrying a package of chalk and a new copybook, and nearly walked directly into him coming up the steps. He caught her elbow to steady her. It was a brief, automatic gesture, the kind a person makes without thinking. He released her immediately and took a step back. "I beg your pardon," he said. His voice was low and unhurried, with the remnant of a southern cadence that had been worn smooth by years in the West, but was still present underneath. He was taller than she had expected, lean in the way of men who worked physically, with dark hair that needed cutting and eyes that were the particular gray-green color of sage in low light. There was a quietness about him that was not unfriendliness but something more like stillness, the kind you see in animals that have learned to conserve themselves. "My fault entirely," Etta said. "I was not looking where I was going." "Neither was I," he said. There was a pause of approximately 1 second in which they looked at each other with the frank, assessing gaze of two people who are each trying to determine something about the other without appearing to do so. "You are the new schoolteacher," he said. "Etta Sawyer," she said. "Joseph Hunter," he said, and shook her hand with the same matter-of-fact courtesy he might have offered another man, which she found she appreciated. Then he went into the store and she went on her way, and that, she told herself, was that. It wasn't, of course. The next time she encountered him was at the church social 3 weeks later, which Etta attended because Mrs. Polk informed her that the schoolteacher was expected to attend, and because she had been in Clover Creek long enough to understand the social architecture of the place. Church socials in 1878, Montana were not primarily religious events. They were the primary mechanism by which a small, isolated community maintained its social bonds, arranged its marriages, settled its disputes informally, and kept itself from flying apart under the pressures of hard winters and harder work. You went to the church social whether you wanted to or not. Joseph Hunter was there. He stood slightly apart from the main gathering, near the corner of the room, with a cup of coffee he was not really drinking, and he watched the social proceedings with the expression of a man fulfilling an obligation he had promised himself he would fulfill. Etta watched him from across the room and felt the particular, inconvenient recognition that occurs when you see someone behaving in a way that you understand from the inside. He was performing being there. So was she. The difference was that she was better at hiding it. She was deep in a conversation with Mrs. Patterson, the doctor's wife, about the school curriculum, when she felt rather than saw him approach. He materialized at the edge of her peripheral vision and waited with that particular stillness until there was a natural pause in the conversation. "Miss Sawyer," he said, when Mrs. Patterson had drifted away toward the refreshment table, "how are you finding Clover Creek?" "Very well," she said. "The children are a pleasure to teach." "I heard Tommy Reeves has taken to reading," he said. She looked at him with mild surprise. "You know Tommy?" "His father runs cattle on the southern section, adjacent to my land. Tommy is a clever boy. His father is glad he is in school." They talked about the children for a few minutes. He knew several of them or knew their families, and he asked intelligent questions and listened to her answers with the kind of attention that is rare enough in any person that it tends to be noticed. "You do not seem to enjoy these occasions," Etta said before she could stop herself. He looked at her steadily. "Does it show that plainly?" "Only if you are paying attention," she said. Something shifted in his expression, not quite a smile, something that was the precursor to one. "No," he said. "I do not particularly enjoy them, but they matter to the community and so I come." "That is exactly my reasoning," she said. There was a moment of recognition between them that was quiet and clean and slightly alarming. He left the social shortly after that. She stayed until the appropriate time. But she found herself, on the walk back to Mrs. Polk's boarding house with the stars very bright above the valley and the first real bite of autumn in the air, thinking about the quality of his attention. The way he had listened. She told herself it was nothing. The following Monday, Tommy Reeves arrived at school with a note for her. The note was from Joseph Hunter. It was written on plain paper in a clear, deliberate hand. It said, "Miss Sawyer, I have a matter of some small urgency regarding the school that I would appreciate the opportunity to discuss at your convenience. If you are able to ride out to the Hunter spread on Wednesday afternoon, I can send the matter back with Tommy. If you would prefer, I can come to town. Whatever is most convenient for you." Etta read the note twice. She asked Tommy, "Do you know what this is about?" Tommy shrugged with the elaborate casualness of a 10-year-old who knew perfectly well what it was about and was not going to say. She wrote back that she would come Wednesday afternoon if someone could lend her a horse, since she did not have one. Tommy returned the next day with a second note saying that Mr. Hunter would send a horse. On Wednesday afternoon, a bay mare arrived at the schoolhouse at the end of the school day, led by the hired man Rufus, who was weathered and brown and about 60 years old, and who had the look of a man who had seen a great deal and judged very little of it. He helped her mount with quiet efficiency, and they rode the 4 miles to the Hunter spread mostly in silence, which suited Etta fine. The ranch emerged gradually from the valley landscape, the fence line first, then the barn, then the house, which was larger than she had expected. Not grand, not the sort of thing you would call imposing, but substantial and well-made, built to last, with a porch along the front that looked out toward the mountains. The cottonwood trees along the creek behind it had gone yellow, and the light in the late afternoon was the particular gold of Montana autumn, thick and slow and almost edible. Joseph Hunter was standing on the porch. He came down to meet her when Rufus brought the horse to the fence. He helped her down with the same matter-of-fact courtesy he'd shown at the store, and she noticed again how he touched her only as much as was necessary and no more, as if he were very careful about the boundaries of other people. "Thank you for coming," he said. "Come in." Inside, the house was spare and clean, with the organized, functional look of a man who had been living alone long enough to settle into his own system. There was a main room with a stone fireplace and a solid table and chairs, a kitchen at the back, and a staircase going up. There were books on a shelf, which surprised her and then, on reflection, didn't. On the table was a collection of papers. He gestured for her to sit and sat across from her. "The matter," he said, "is this. I have been thinking since the church social that the school is underfunded. I know the school board pays your salary and provides the building, but the children need more. More books, more materials. Tommy came home last week and told his father that you had used your own money to buy him a copybook. His father told me, that is not right." Etta felt a flush of something that was not quite embarrassment and not quite gratitude. "It was a small expense," she said. "It should not have been yours to bear," he said. "I would like to contribute to the school. Directly, not through the school board, because the school board has a tendency to redirect funds into things that are not the school. I wanted to ask you what you need." She looked at him for a moment. This was not what she had expected. She had prepared herself on the ride out for something more personal, something requiring the careful management of expectations, and she felt slightly off balance now that it was simply this, a practical and generous offer made without fanfare or motive she could detect. "I would need to know the extent of what you are offering," she said carefully, "before I could give you a proper list." "Name what the school needs," he said. "I will tell you what I can do." They spent the better part of an hour at that table, talking about books and chalk and slates, and the need for a proper globe and the question of whether there was any chance of getting a second room added to the schoolhouse for the older children. He listened, asked precise questions, and made notes. By the end of it, they had a practical list and a rough estimate of what it would cost. At some point during this conversation, Etta stopped being careful. It happened gradually, the way most important things happen. She stopped measuring her words with the particular precision she applied to all conversations with men who might have intentions, and she simply talked about the school, because the school was what she cared about most, and he was asking questions that deserved real answers. She talked about Tommy Reeves and Clara Jennings and the three Haverson brothers who were all different as a summer day from a winter night. She talked about what the children of Clover Creek needed, and what they were capable of, and what an education could mean to them in ways that went beyond reading and arithmetic. He listened to all of it with that quality of attention she had noticed before. When she realized she had been talking for 20 minutes without stopping, she stopped abruptly and said, "I apologize. You did not ask for a speech." "I asked for what the school needs," he said. "That is what the school needs, a teacher who cares that much." There was a silence in which neither of them looked directly at the other. Then he said, "Stay for supper, Miss Sawyer. Rufus won't get you back before dark anyway, and he might as well have a meal first." It was that simple. "Just stay for supper," he said. Rufus, it turned out, was an excellent cook. He produced a meal of venison stew and fresh bread and dried apple pie that was the best food Etta had eaten since leaving St. Louis, and the three of them ate at the big table with the kind of easy, unforced conversation that surprised her. Rufus was laconic but occasionally devastating in the way of a man who chose his words with great care precisely because he used so few of them. Joseph was quieter at the table than he had been across it, but he laughed twice, a low, brief sound that seemed to surprise him each time, as if he had forgotten he was capable of it. When she left that evening, riding back to Clover Creek in the cool dark with Rufus leading the way by lantern, Etta sat very straight in the saddle and told herself very firmly that she had gone out there on school business, had accomplished the purpose of her visit, and would not be manufacturing reasons to go back. She was back the following week. The books Joseph had ordered arrived from Helena, a collection of 20 readers, 2 arithmetic texts, a proper grammar, and, unexpectedly, a copy of David Copperfield and Great Expectations and a complete illustrated atlas. He sent a note with Tommy saying she should come look them over and decide how to distribute them. This was reasonable. She went. They spent the afternoon organizing the books at the big table. Then it was late and Rufus had made supper. The week after that, he came to town with a load of lumber that he said was for the proposed addition to the schoolhouse, and they spent an hour at the school looking at the structure and discussing what was possible. Then it was midday and he asked if she had eaten. They had lunch at the small cafe that Henderson's wife ran and talked for 2 hours, and Etta walked back to the boarding house afterward and stood in her room and looked at the wall for a long moment and acknowledged to herself, with the honesty she tried always to maintain with herself, that she was in significant trouble. Mrs. Polk, who missed nothing, said at supper that evening, "I see you had lunch with Joseph Hunter." "We were discussing the school addition," Etta said. "Of course you were," Mrs. Polk said serenely, and changed the subject. October moved toward November. The school addition was framed and roofed by the second week, with Joseph doing most of the work himself alongside Rufus and 2 other men from neighboring ranches. Etta had protested the personal labor, but Joseph said simply that it was faster this way, and there was no arguing with efficiency. The day the addition was finished, she stood in the new room and ran her hand along the fresh wood of the wall and felt something she recognized as happiness, clear and uncomplicated, and then looked up and found Joseph watching her from the doorway with an expression she did not know how to read. "It is exactly right," she said. "Good," he said. That evening she rode back to the ranch with him, because she had been there when the work was done, and it seemed natural, and Rufus made a proper celebratory supper, and they sat around the table until it was late enough that Joseph said, with the same quiet matter-of-factness with which he said most things, that it was too dark and too cold for her to ride back and the guest room was made up. This was the first night she stayed. She lay in the guest room under a good quilt and looked at the ceiling and listened to the sounds of the house settling in the cold, the wind outside, the distant sound of cattle, and thought about the very specific and dangerous situation she was constructing for herself, one reasonable visit at a time. In the morning Rufus made flapjacks and coffee and Joseph was at the table already, with the previous day's Helena newspaper that had come in on the stage, and he handed her a section without looking up, and she sat down and poured coffee and read, and the silence between them was the most comfortable silence she had experienced since coming west. She did not know how to reconcile this with her intentions. She told herself on the ride back to town that she was simply a practical woman adjusting to practical circumstances. She liked Joseph Hunter. She respected him. She valued his company. None of this had to be more than it was, but she knew, with the same honesty that she tried to apply to everything, that she was lying to herself. What she had not told anyone in Clover Creek, what she had not told Mrs. Polk or the school board or any of the women who had been kind to her and curious about her, was the reason she had left St. Louis. His name had been Daniel Hartley. He had been 30 years old, a banker's son, articulate and easy with words and possessed of a great talent for telling a woman exactly what she wanted to hear. They had been engaged for 7 months. She had believed everything. She had been wrong about most of it. The betrayal had not been dramatic. That was the worst part of it. There was no explosion, no single revelatory moment. There had been a slow accumulation of things that didn't add up, a story that changed in its details, a pattern of absence and excuse, and finally a conversation with a woman named Catherine who had been married to Daniel Hartley for 4 years and had no idea Etta existed. Etta had done 2 things after that. She had returned Daniel's ring, and she had applied for the teaching position in Clover Creek, Montana Territory, which was as far from St. Louis as she could get while remaining in the country and still using her skills. She had come west specifically to be safe from the kind of hope that had made her stupid before. And now here was Joseph Hunter, steadily and apparently unconsciously dismantling all of her carefully constructed defenses by being simply and genuinely himself. She was not afraid that he was Daniel Hartley. She was afraid that he was nothing like Daniel Hartley, that he was genuine and good and real, and that she was going to fall in love with him anyway, and it was going to hurt anyway, because love always costs something and she was not sure she had enough left to pay. The first snow came on the 1st of November, light and fast, gone by afternoon. It came again a week later and stayed. The school edition was put to immediate use as the weather drove the children indoors for afternoon lessons. The materials Joseph had supplied made the classroom almost luxuriously equipped by the standards of the territory. Clara Jennings finished Great Expectations by mid-November and came to Etta on a Thursday afternoon with an expression of someone who has been shown a door they didn't know existed. "Can I read the other one?" she asked. "David Copperfield." "It is very long," Etta said. "I know," Clara said. "Can I read it?" Etta gave her the book. Joseph came to town less often as November deepened, and the work of the ranch became the work of winter preparation. Moving cattle, bringing horses in, stacking hay, checking fences against the coming cold. When he came, he always found a reason to speak with her, and the conversations were always ostensibly practical and always ran long. On a Saturday in late November, he came into Henderson's store while she was there, and they ended up walking back to the boarding house together in the cold, talking about a book they had both read. A collection of essays by Ralph Waldo Emerson that Henderson had received by accident in a shipment, and sold to Joseph, and that Etta had borrowed from him. She was not sure how they had gotten onto the subject. It was the kind of conversation that seemed to have started itself. At Mrs. Polk's gate he stopped and she stopped. The cold was sharp and the sky was the dark iron of late afternoon and she could see her breath. "I would like to ask you something," he said, and stopped. She waited. "I realize," he said slowly, as though testing each word before committing to it, "that it has become a habit to expect your company. I would like to know whether that is something you object to." The way he asked it was so careful, so stripped of any demand or assumption that it made her chest ache. "No," she said. "I do not object to it." He nodded. A pause. "Then I hope you will come for supper Sunday," he said. "I will come Sunday," she said. She went inside and closed the gate and did not let herself look back at him, because she was very much afraid of what her face might be doing. December was hard. Not the cold itself, though that was considerable, but the weight of the season, the way the world contracted to the span of what you could see through a frosted window, the early darkness, the intimacy of closed spaces. At the ranch she found herself noticing the small evidence of the life he had built there, the books arranged by subject on the shelf, the coffee tin always in the same place, the way he sat on the left side of the fireplace in the evenings with a book while Rufus dozed in the chair opposite, and the snow came down outside. She began to fit herself into these spaces without thinking about it, taking the other chair, reading her own book, the fire warm and the lamps gold. These evenings were where it happened, not in any single declared moment, but in the accumulated evidence of 100 small ones. The evening he looked up from his book and started to say something, and then stopped and said instead, "You have ink on your cheek," and reached out and rubbed it away with his thumb, and the touch was there and gone in an instant, but the warmth of it lingered for an hour. The night the temperature dropped severely, and she woke in the guest room to the sound of him checking the fire downstairs and adding wood, quiet and careful not to wake her, and she lay in the dark and felt the particular helpless tenderness of knowing someone was looking after things while you slept. The afternoon he found her in the kitchen helping Rufus make bread because she'd grown up doing it and missed it, and he stood in the doorway and watched with an expression that was the closest thing to unguarded she had seen on him. Something soft and private that he put away when he realized she had noticed, but not quite fast enough. Christmas came. She stayed through it, because the roads had been bad for 2 weeks and the stage was uncertain, and because Mrs. Polk had gone to her daughter's family in Helena, and the boarding house was cold and empty. Joseph said she was welcome to stay, and Rufus made a Christmas dinner of a quality that made Etta suspect he had been a professional cook at some point, which, it turned out, he had been, in a hotel in Denver before he came north. They exchanged gifts because it was Christmas and it seemed right. He gave her a new book, a copy of George Eliot's Middlemarch, which had come out a few years ago and which she had wanted to read for years. She gave him a pair of good wool gloves she had knitted in the evenings. The exchange was simple and easy, and he looked at the gloves with the careful attention he gave to things that mattered and said, "Thank you, Etta," and it was the first time he had used her given name. She thought about that for the rest of the day. In January, the blizzard came. She had been at the ranch for 3 days already when it started. She had planned to go back to town that Thursday, but Wednesday evening the sky had taken on a particular look that Rufus described with one word, storm, and by Thursday morning the world was white and moving, and the temperature had dropped to a place where the air hurt to breathe. She could not go anywhere. She stood at the window that morning and watched the snow pile against the fence posts and understood that she was not going anywhere, and felt the truth of what she had been refusing to name for 3 months settle into her like something inevitable. She heard him behind her in the kitchen. She turned around. He was standing in the doorway between the kitchen and the main room holding a coffee cup, looking at her with the expression he only had when he thought she wasn't looking, open and undefended and full of something that made her ribs feel tight. "I suppose I am still here," she said. "I know," he said. "You said supper," she said. "October." A pause. Something moved in his face. "I know," he said again, and there was the ghost of something that might almost be called amusement in it, but beneath it was something much less easy, something honest and vulnerable and held carefully. "Joseph," she said. He set the coffee cup down on the table. "I have been trying," he said slowly, "to do this correctly, to not push, to not ask for something you had not offered. You are here because the weather keeps you here, and I do not want you to think that I planned that." "I know you did not plan a blizzard," she said. "What I am trying to say," he said, with the deliberate patience of a man choosing hard words, "is that you can stay through the spring and into the summer, and as long as you want, and I will never ask you for more than you are willing to give. But I also will not keep pretending that I do not want you to stay, because I do want you to stay, Etta. I want you to stay a very great deal." She was very still. "I am not easy," she said eventually. "I have been hurt before. I have a habit of not trusting things that feel good because I have been wrong before about what they meant." "I know," he said. He had not moved. He was giving her all the space she might need to back away from this. "I am also," she said, "not remotely interested in leaving." He let out a breath. She crossed the room and he met her halfway, and when he finally touched her, when he put his hands on her face and looked at her for a long moment as if making sure this was real, she understood that this man had been as frightened as she was and had been as careful, and that all the care they had been taking with each other was not avoidance but respect, and that there was something enormously rare in that. When he kissed her, it was not like Daniel Hartley's kisses, which had always felt slightly performative, as if he were playing the role of a man in love. It was quiet and real and unhurried, and when he pulled back and rested his forehead against hers, they stood like that in the warm kitchen with the blizzard howling outside and the fire crackling in the next room, and neither of them said anything because there was nothing that needed to be said. The blizzard lasted 4 more days. These were 4 days that Etta would remember for the rest of her life, not for any single dramatic event, but for the quality of them, the way time moved differently, slow and full, the way the world contracted to this house, and these 2 people and the old man dozing by the fire, the way they found themselves talking in the evenings until well past midnight about things she had never told anyone. Her mother, Daniel, her fear of being deceived again, her love for the work of teaching, the particular grief of caring about children, You would eventually have to let go. He talked too, more than she had heard him talk before, about Tennessee, about his family, about coming west with nothing and building something from nothing, about his wife Alina who had died of fever 3 years ago, and how the grief of it had been not just the loss of her, but the loss of the future they had imagined together. "I thought I would not do this again," he said once, looking at the fire. "Not because I did not want to, but because it seemed like a kind of arrogance to expect twice." "Do you think love is finite?" she asked. He considered this seriously, as he considered most things. "I think grief can make you feel that way, but no, I don't think the heart keeps a ledger." She thought about Daniel, about the way she had closed herself after that, the careful architecture of protection she had built. "I thought I was done trusting people," she said. "You trusted the children," he said. She looked at him. "You trust Tommy Reeves," he said, "and Clara Jennings. I have watched you with them. You are not a woman who stopped trusting. You are a woman who started being careful about who earned it." She had to look away from him after that. On the 5th day the storm stopped, and the world was still and white and breathtakingly silent, the kind of silence that only happens after great noise. Rufus went out early to check the cattle and came back saying everything was accounted for, and the creek was frozen solid, but the pipes were clear. Etta stood on the porch in the morning light and looked at the buried valley and thought about the letter she would need to write to the school board explaining her absence, and thought about the fact that she could go back to the boarding house now, that the roads would be passable in a day or two, that there was nothing keeping her at the Hunter Ranch any longer except the fact that she wanted to be there. Joseph came to stand beside her on the porch. "I will take you back to town whenever you are ready," he said. "Rufus can come with us." She was quiet for a moment. "I have been thinking," she said, "about what is practical." "All right," he said. "I am contracted to the school board through June," she said. "I have an obligation to those children and I take it seriously." "I know you do," he said. "The school is 4 miles from here," she said. "It is," he said. "Rufus could drive me in the mornings and come for me in the evenings," she said. "Or I could ride the bay mare if the weather permitted, which would not be every day in winter, but would be possible in the spring and fall." A silence. "Etta," he said very carefully. "What I am saying," she said, and she was aware that she was speaking carefully too, that they were two very careful people feeling their way towards something that neither of them was going to handle in a careless way, "is that if you were to ask me a formal question I would not refuse you, but I would need the school to continue. I would need the children to have what they need. Those are not negotiable." "I would not negotiate them," he said immediately. "I would not ask you to give up your work. It is part of who you are." She turned to look at him. He was looking at her with that direct steadiness that she had come to understand was the truest expression of who he was. "Then ask me," she said. He was quiet for a moment. Then he turned fully toward her on the porch in the cold white morning, the mountains behind him and the snow-covered valley spread out before them. "Etta Sawyer," he said, "I would like you to stay, not for supper and not for the winter, permanently if you are willing, as my wife if you will have me." The air was cold and still and tasted of pine and winter. "Yes," she said, "I will have you." He took both her hands in his. His hands were warm around her cold fingers. He looked at her for a long moment, and then he pulled her close and she put her face against his shoulder, and he held her there on the porch with the winter sun just clearing the ridge and the snow glittering and the whole world impossibly, specifically, beautifully quiet. Rufus, coming around the corner of the house with a bucket of water, saw them, turned around, and went back the way he had come, which was the closest thing to a romantic gesture the old man would ever make. And Etta, who had not heard him, would only learn about it later from Joseph, who had. The practical business of what they were now was attended to with the same directness they had applied to everything else. Joseph rode into Clover Creek 2 days later to speak with the Reverend Hayes, which in 1878 Montana Territory was the necessary first step in any legitimate marriage arrangement. Etta rode with him and they went together to Mrs. Polk's boarding house, where Mrs. Polk opened the door, looked at the two of them standing on her step and said, "Well, it is about time," before they had said a single word. The news spread through Clover Creek with the velocity that news always traveled in small towns, which is to say by the next morning everyone knew. The responses were, on the whole, warm. The school board called a meeting that Etta attended with calm determination and proposed the arrangement that she had described to Joseph on the porch, which was that she would complete her contract through June, and they would discuss the following year after that. The school board, two of whose members had daughters who attended Etta's school and had been transformed by it, agreed. One of the members, a farmer named Caldwell, went so far as to say that a married schoolteacher was better than no schoolteacher, which was not the most gracious possible support, but Etta accepted it in the spirit in which it was offered. Gerald Fitch, who had proposed by letter in Etta's first week, was heard to say at Henderson's store that he had been considering renewing his suit and had been just about to do so, which everyone in earshot understood was not true but allowed him to save face, which was kind enough. The wedding was on a Saturday in late February, which in 1878 Montana Territory was early enough in the year that the temperature was still well below freezing, but late enough that the days were noticeably longer, and the light had a quality that felt like promise. Reverend Hayes performed the ceremony in the church. Mrs. Polk cried, which surprised everyone including Mrs. Polk. Clara Jennings, who had been allowed to attend with her parents, presented Etta with a letter she had written herself, sealed with wax, which Etta tucked into her bodice and did not read until that evening, alone in the ranch house bedroom, sitting on the edge of the bed, and which said, "Dear Miss Sawyer, I think you are the bravest person I know, and I want to be a teacher someday too. I hope you will still teach us even though you are Mrs. Hunter now. Your student forever, Clara Jennings." Etta sat with that letter in her hands for a long time. She was going to keep that letter until she was an old woman. She was Mrs. Hunter now. The name felt foreign and right at the same time, the way a new coat feels, slightly stiff at first but made exactly for you. The first weeks of being married were not without their adjustments. Etta had lived alone, or effectively alone, for years. She had her own routines, her own ways of organizing space, her own precise requirements about where things were kept. Joseph had his own systems, established over years of bachelor living, and the initial negotiation of shared space required a patience that both of them brought to it, though not always without a certain amount of compressed amusement. The most memorable of these early adjustments was the question of the coffee. Joseph made coffee that was approximately the consistency of road tar, which he had apparently consumed for so long that he had lost any sense of this as unusual. Etta made coffee that was, by the standards of the period, unremarkably strong. The morning she made the first pot after moving in, Joseph drank it and then looked at his cup with an expression of polite confusion. "This is very good," he said. "It is just coffee," she said. "Mine is not like this," he said. "No," she said. "It is not." He looked at her for a moment and then laughed. The real laugh, the one that still seemed to surprise him when it happened, and something in the room changed, became lighter. "All right," he said. "You make the coffee." This became a fact of their life. She made the coffee, he made the fire, Rufus made everything else. The household found its rhythm. Spring came slowly, the way spring comes in Montana, not in a rush but in a gradual yielding, inch by inch. The snow pulling back from the south-facing slopes first, then the creek breaking up with a sound that you could hear from the house on a still night, then the mud, then the first impossible green along the creek banks. Then one morning Etta walked outside and smelled the earth alive again, and stood there on the porch with her face turned up to the sun and thought, "I am happy." Not careful happiness, not happiness held at arm's length and tested for credibility. The real thing, the kind that does not need to explain itself. She taught through June as she had promised, riding the bay mare she had come to think of as hers into Clover Creek every morning and back in the evening, or with Rufus when the rain made the roads bad. Clara Jennings finished David Copperfield and began Middlemark. Tommy Reeves, who had been barely literate in September, could now read anything put in front of him, and had begun helping the younger children with their letters in a way that showed the instincts of a natural teacher. Etta watched him doing it one afternoon with a feeling in her chest that was the particular, irreplaceable satisfaction of work that matters. She told Joseph about it at supper that evening and watched him listen with that full, attentive quality of his. And when she finished, he said, "Tommy is going to be all right." And she knew he meant it in the largest possible sense. In June, she had the necessary conversation with the school board, and they offered her a second contract, this time at $38 per month. An increase that she suspected was partly Joseph's influence, but that she chose not to investigate too closely because the money went to the school. Summer on the ranch was the fullest kind of busy. The cattle work was constant from before sunrise to after sunset, and Etta found herself learning the rhythms of it whether she intended to or not. The branding and the roundups, and the business of managing the land and the water and the fences. The constant calibration of what the land needed and what it could give. She was not a rancher, and she did not pretend to be, but she understood work and she understood dedication, and she recognized in Joseph's relationship with his land the same quality she had with her students, a love that was also a responsibility. She helped where she could and did not pretend to expertise she didn't have, which Joseph seemed to appreciate. One hot July afternoon, she was helping hang laundry on the line behind the house, and Rufus came out of the kitchen and stood on the back step and said, without preamble, "He was not this way before. Since you came, he laughs now." He went back inside before she could respond. She stood there with a wet sheet in her hands and the summer wind hot from the south and the mountains blue in the distance, and felt the weight of that, the responsibility and the gift of it both. She laughed now too. She had not fully noticed until that moment how much she had stopped laughing in Missouri, how she had contracted in the years after Daniel, making herself smaller and more careful, and less given to the open, undefended joy that had been natural to her before she had learned to be afraid. Coming west had started the reversal. The children had continued it, and Joseph had completed it without doing anything deliberate except being present and real and consistently himself. She finished hanging the laundry and went inside and found him at the kitchen table going over the account books, which he did every Friday with a thoroughness that reminded her of the way he built things, each entry placed with care. She came up behind him and put her arms around his shoulders and rested her chin on top of his head, a gesture of easy affection that still sometimes caught them both slightly off guard, because they were both people who had lived a long time without this kind of casual touching. "Rufus says you are laughing again," she said. "Rufus says too much," he said, but she could hear the smile in it. "I think he says exactly the right amount," she said. He turned his head and looked up at her upside down, which made them both laugh. And there it was, the evidence Rufus had been reporting, the unguarded, real laugh that told you everything about the man. August brought a dry spell that had everyone in the valley watching the creek levels with concern. The cattle needed water, and the grass was burning off earlier than usual. Joseph spent long days on horseback checking the land and making decisions about where to move the animals and when. Etta rode out with him sometimes on Sundays, the bay mare keeping pace with his larger roan, learning the land through his relationship with it. It was on one of these Sunday rides that she told him. They were on the ridge above the north pasture, the whole valley spread out below them in the flat white light of a dry afternoon, when she said, with the directness she had always valued in herself, "I believe I am expecting a child." He turned to look at her from the roan. She watched his face move through something, the surprise, the assessment, and then something very quiet and very deep that settled there and stayed. "Are you certain?" he asked. "Not entirely," she said, "but I think so. Dr. Alderman can tell us for certain." "Are you all right?" he asked. Not the other questions, not the practical ones, that one first. "Yes," she said, "I am well. I am also somewhat alarmed," she added honestly, "and also not alarmed at all, which is confusing." "Yes," he said, "I understand the feeling exactly. They looked at the valley for a moment in the dry afternoon light. "I want this," he said, quietly, simply, as he said most things that were true. "So do I," she said. Dr. Alderman confirmed it the following week. She was about 3 months along, he estimated, which meant a late winter arrival, February or early March of 1879. The news, when it reached Clover Creek, produced the warmth that small communities produce for these occasions. Mrs. Polk, who had taken to riding out to the ranch every other Sunday now, with the stated purpose of checking on the proper management of the household and the unstated purpose of having people to care about, declared that she had known since January that this was how things would go, a claim that was probably more retrospective than it appeared, but that no one disputed. Clara Jennings, now in her second year of school, asked Etta with a child's directness whether she would keep teaching when the baby came, and Etta said yes, though she might need to take some months off, and she had been thinking about whether Mrs. Polk might be willing to take the class during that time. Mrs. Polk, when approached, said she had been a schoolteacher herself for 6 years in Kansas and would be glad to, as long as everything was done her way, which Etta agreed to with a suppressed smile. The fall of 1878 was the best Etta had known. Not the easiest. The work was constant, and the ranch had its demands, and the school had its demands, and she had to learn, gradually and imperfectly, how to hold both without one consuming the other. But the best, in the sense of the richest, the most textured, the most full of the things that make a life feel real. Joseph building things. This was what she noticed as autumn settled in again, a year after she had first ridden out to the ranch. He was always building or fixing or improving, not restlessly, not out of dissatisfaction, but with the purposeful satisfaction of a man who liked to make things solid and lasting. He added shelves to the kitchen, because she needed more space for the provisions she was putting up for winter. He built a bookcase for the main room because her books had outgrown the existing shelf. He spent 3 weeks in October on a new corral that was stronger and better designed than the one it replaced. One evening she was sitting by the fire reading and looked up and found him watching her with that expression again, the open, unguarded one. "What is it?" she asked. "Nothing," he said. "I am just glad you stayed." She put her book down. "You mean for supper," she said. "For supper," he said, "and then for everything else." She got up from her chair and went and sat beside him on the settee, and he put his arm around her and she leaned against him, and the fire was warm, and outside the first October snow was beginning to fall, light and preliminary, just a reminder of what was coming. "I am glad I stayed too," she said. The winter was easier the second time, because she knew what it was. She knew the way the snow changed the world, and the way the silence had its own sound, and the way the cold was something you learned to live inside of rather than fight against. She knew the particular quality of firelight on January evenings, and the sound of the creek under ice, and the way the horses were in the morning when you fed them in the barn, their breath rising in white clouds and their eyes warm in the cold dark. She taught through December, riding the bay mare on the clear days and having Rufus drive the wagon on the days when the roads were uncertain. And when the snow got too deep and the cold too severe, she stayed at the ranch and sent work home with the older students to share with the younger ones. The school board grumbled about this arrangement, but the parents, who were practical people who understood weather, supported it, and the school board grumbled more quietly. The baby came on the 4th of March, 1879, which was later than Dr. Alderman's estimate. He came at 2 in the morning, which surprised no one who knew anything about the timing of these events, in a snowstorm that kept everything around the ranch house very quiet and very white, and he was healthy and loud from the first moment, which Dr. Alderman, who had been kept at the ranch for 2 days by the approaching storm just in case, said was a good sign. Joseph held his son with the expression of a man whose internal architecture has been fundamentally altered, which it had. He was very still, the way he was still when things were important, and he looked at this new person in his arms with a wonder that he did not try to hide. "What will we call him?" Etta asked. She was tired in the specific way of a woman who has just done something enormous, tired and clear and strangely light. "I would like to call him Thomas," Joseph said, "if you are agreeable." "After anyone?" she asked. "My father," he said. "Thomas Hunter, he was a good man." "Thomas Hunter," she said. "Yes, that is right." Thomas Hunter was a good baby, or at least a baby of average demands, which in the context of the year 1879 on a Montana ranch was effectively the same thing. He slept in what had been the guest room, now repurposed, and he was the center of an attention that included not just his parents but Rufus, who had been observed in the barn talking to the baby in a low voice while the baby looked at him with the profound, unfocused interest of a 4-week-old, and Mrs. Polk, who came every Sunday now without exception, and who was openly and completely undone by Thomas Hunter, which seemed to satisfy something in her that she had not known was unmet. Etta returned to the school in late April. Mrs. Polk had managed the class competently, and with a firmness that the students had apparently respected, though Clara Jennings later told Etta privately that Mrs. Polk had made them do a great deal of copying, which she regarded as less interesting than what Etta did with them. Etta took this as information she could act on. The school that spring was changed in the particular way that things change when you have been away from them and then returned. She saw the children differently, with a sharpened attention. She saw how much they had grown and changed in the months she had been occupied with other enormous things. Tommy Reeves was now helping with the younger children as a matter of course, an informal junior teacher at 12 years old, and he had begun talking about wanting to go to school in Helena someday, to study properly. Etta began composing a letter to the Montana Territorial Board of Education in her mind, the kind of letter that would lay out the case for scholarship funds for exceptional students from rural territories. She wrote the letter and sent it and received a polite but interested response 3 months later, which she showed to Joseph and which he read with attention and said, "This might work." "It might," she said. "Write the follow-up," he said. She wrote the follow-up. The summer of 1879 was different from the summer before. Thomas was 4 months old in July and had discovered that he could make deliberate sounds with his mouth, a discovery he communicated to anyone in range at considerable volume. He also had Joseph's eyes, the gray-green sage color, which Etta found herself looking at with a quality of feeling she had not anticipated, the way those eyes looked back at her from this new small person's face. One hot evening in August, when the day's work was done and Thomas was asleep and Rufus had gone to his cabin and the house was quiet, she and Joseph sat on the porch watching the late light on the mountains, and she said, out of a comfortable silence, "I think about the version of me that never came to Clover Creek." "What about her?" he said. "She would have stayed in St. Louis," Etta said. "She would have kept her guard up forever. She would have been safe and alone and missed this completely." He was quiet for a moment. "I think about the version of me that never went to Henderson's store that day," he said, "or went 5 minutes later." She turned to look at him. He was watching the mountains with the side of his face toward her, the line of it quiet and familiar and dear. "I think timing is more fragile than we ever believe it to be," she said. "Yes," he said, "and more reliable." She thought about that. "You mean it has its own kind of structure," she said. "I mean," he said, "that I believe things find their way to where they are supposed to be. I don't know what that says about everything. I just know it seems to be true about this." The porch was warm and the mountains were going purple, and below them the valley was settling into evening, and inside the house their son was sleeping and Rufus was in his cabin and the horses were in the pasture and the fire was banked low in the kitchen stove. She put her hand over his on the armrest between their chairs. He turned it over and held hers. "I know it is true about this," she said. October came again. 1 full year since she had first ridden up to this house. The cottonwoods along the creek were yellow again, and the light was the same thick gold, and the mountains were sharp and blue. She rode out to the north pasture on a Sunday with Joseph, and they sat their horses on the ridge the way they had before and looked at the valley, and she thought about that day, the day she had told him about the baby, and how different the world had looked from the same view in the space of a year. Thomas was in the house with Mrs. Polk, who had moved into a standing Sunday arrangement that suited everyone perfectly, and that Thomas had adapted to with the equanimity of a baby who knew when he was well taken care of. "A year ago," she said. "A year ago today," he agreed. They looked at the valley. "Are you happy?" He asked with the directness that she loved in him, the refusal to dress things up. "Yes," she said with equal directness. "Are you?" "More than I believed I was allowed to be," he said. She thought about that phrase, allowed to be. She understood what was underneath it. "Eleanor would want you to be," she said gently. He was quiet for a moment. "I know," he said. "I have come to believe that." Below them the valley was gold and amber, and the creek was a silver line through it, and the smoke from the ranch house chimney was rising straight in the still air. Their life, visible from here. All of it built from the simplest possible beginning. Just supper, he had said. The winter of 1879 into 1880 brought its own events. The territorial legislature, responding in part to a letter-writing campaign that several parents from around Clover Creek had been quietly conducting, voted to increase funding for rural schools, a decision that meant Etta could expand the school's library, add to the materials, and bring in a second teacher for the larger class. The second teacher was a young woman named Alice Brooks, 22 years old, fresh from the normal school in Illinois, who arrived in October and was immediately adopted by Mrs. Polk in much the way that Etta had been, which gave Etta a small, private pleasure that felt like completion of a circle. Tommy Reeves's letter of recommendation, written by Etta and supported by a letter from Joseph Hunter detailing Tommy's character and ability, was submitted to the scholarship committee in Helena in November. The response came in February. Tommy Reeves had been awarded a scholarship to attend the Helena Academy, beginning the following September. Etta told him on a Monday morning before the other students arrived. Tommy sat very still for a moment after she finished telling him, the way very young people sometimes go still when something large is happening that they do not yet have the scale to hold. Then he looked at her and said, "Because of you." "Because of you," she said. "I only wrote down what was already true." He nodded several times rapidly, which she recognized as a boy's way of managing something that might otherwise become visible on his face. That afternoon she told Joseph. He read the letter from the scholarship committee and handed it back to her and said, "You should frame this one." "Tommy should have it," she said. "Make a copy," he said. "Keep the copy." She made the copy. February of 1880 also brought a second unexpected event. Etta discovered she was expecting again. Thomas was nearly a year old and thriving, a strong, curious boy who had recently begun pulling himself upright on furniture and looking out at the world from this new height with an expression of profound satisfaction. Another baby was not something they had specifically planned or specifically avoided, and the news arrived with the same combination of magnitude and simple rightness that most important things in her life now seemed to carry. This time she told Joseph in the morning, at the kitchen table, over coffee, with the directness that had become the common language between them. He looked at her across his cup for a moment. "Good," he said. "That is all," she said. "I have a great deal more to say," he said. "But it is all variations on good, and you know that already." She did know it. She also knew that in the privacy of the bedroom that evening, away from the morning's practicality, he would hold her with a fullness of feeling that he expressed more in touch than in words, which she had learned over the past year was not a limitation but a different and equally fluent language. She was right. Spring came, and with it, the mud and the green and the smell of the earth opening up, and Thomas began walking, which was an event of such concentrated comedy and wonder that even Rufus abandoned all pretense of taciturnity, and could be found on multiple occasions crouched at the boy's level making encouraging sounds that bore no relationship to his usual verbal economy. Clara Jennings, 13 years old in the spring of 1880, had by now read everything in the school library and had begun writing her own stories. which she brought to Etta with a combination of bravado and terror that Etta recognized from her own younger self. The way you held out a piece of your interior life, hoping both that it was good and that you could take it back if it wasn't. Etta read each one carefully and told Clara the truth about what worked and what didn't, because Clara was too intelligent to benefit from anything less. One afternoon she brought one of Clara's stories home and left it on the table and came back to find Joseph reading it. "This child," he said, not looking up. "I know," Etta said. "Is she going to be able to do something with this?" he said. "Not unless someone makes it possible," Etta said. "She is a girl in 1880 in Montana Territory. The path is not obvious." He was quiet for a moment reading. Then he said, "Write the letter." "What letter?" "Whatever letter makes the path less difficult," he said. "You are good at writing letters." Etta looked at him. "You understand," she said, "that I have been trying to do exactly that since I got here." "I know," he said. "I am saying do not stop." She sat down across from him at the table, the same table where they had once compiled the list of things the school needed, and thought about the arc of all of it. "You are a remarkable person," she said. He looked up from Clara's story. "You are far more remarkable," he said, in the matter-of-fact tone that meant he was not trying to say something charming, just something true. Summer. Thomas in the garden, fascinated by everything he could get his hands on, which was everything. Etta's pregnancy visible now. The second child making itself known with less ceremony than the first, but no less reality. Rufus, who had been with Joseph for nearly 8 years now, and who Etta had come to think of as part of the family in the way that certain people simply become part of what you are, turned 63 that summer, a fact he disclosed by accident, and then seemed to regret mentioning. Joseph gave him a new saddle, which was exactly the right gift, and which Rufus accepted by running his hands over it in the workshop for about 10 minutes, and saying nothing at all, and then going out to tend the horses, which was as close to overcome as he allowed himself. The second baby arrived on October 7th, 1880, which was the best possible timing from the perspective of the school year and the ranch work and Etta's own sense of order. She was a girl, which delighted Joseph, who said he had been hoping for a daughter, and delighted Thomas, who was now 20 months old and had developed an opinion about most things. They named her Alina after Joseph's first wife, which was Etta's suggestion. She had thought about it for months and she was certain. Alina had been real, and she had been loved, and she deserved to be remembered with more than silence. Joseph, when she told him what she wanted, had been very still for a moment, and then had looked at her with an expression she had never seen on him before, one that was past words, and she had understood that she had done exactly the right thing. Alina Hunter arrived in October and immediately demonstrated a personality that was clear, loud, and decisive, qualities that everyone who knew her mother found entirely unsurprising. Thomas, introduced to his sister, studied her with the analytical intensity of a toddler encountering a fundamentally confusing object, and then patted her head very gently and said something that was not quite a word, but was clearly intended as a greeting, which Etta found more moving than she had expected. The fall and winter of 1880 into 1881 were full in the way that a house with 2 small children and 2 adults who both worked at things that mattered is full. Full of noise and weather and work, and the constant management of competing demands, and the specific, unrepeatable texture of being alive in a particular time and place with particular people. There were hard days. Days when Thomas was sick and Alina was sleepless, and the weather was bad and the cattle had problems, and Etta was exhausted to the marrow, and Joseph was short with everyone including himself. Days when the loneliness of the territory felt real, the distance from any other kind of life, the absence of certain things that Etta had not known she would miss until she missed them. Days when she felt the weight of what had been left behind in Missouri and wondered, briefly and honestly, what other path might have been available. And then there were evenings when both children were asleep, and the house was quiet, and she was at the kitchen table writing her letters or preparing lessons, and Joseph was reading in the other room, and Rufus was in his cabin, and the fire was warm, and the stars were extraordinary through the clear, cold windows. And the life she had was so specifically and exactly what she would have chosen, given the choice, that the wonder of it made her sit still for a moment with her pen in her hand. She had not chosen it exactly. She had chosen a teaching position in a small town in Montana Territory. Everything else had arrived from an invitation to supper on an October afternoon. But that was how things worked, she had come to believe. You made the choice you could see, and if you were paying attention and honest with yourself and willing to be afraid without letting the fear make your decisions for you, the rest came toward you and you came toward it and met in the middle. Tommy Reeves left for Helena and the Academy in September of 1881. He came to say goodbye on a Saturday morning at the ranch, which surprised Etta and then, on reflection, didn't. He shook Joseph's hand and accepted the handshake with a gravity that showed he understood what it meant. He hugged Etta, which neither of them had done before and which felt entirely natural, and he held onto her for slightly longer than the intended moment, and she felt his shoulders work briefly and then steady. "You are ready," she said quietly. "Because of you," he said. "Go be good, Tommy," she said. He went. She stood on the porch after he rode away toward Clover Creek and felt the particular sweetness and ache of letting something you helped build go off into the world to become what it was supposed to become. Joseph came to stand beside her. "He is going to be fine," he said. "I know," she said. "Are you all right?" he asked. "Yes," she said. "I am proud." They stood on the porch, and the September light was warm and golden, and the valley was at its best. The grass still green along the creek, and the mountains vivid with early autumn, and the sky a blue that seemed engineered for the purpose of making you understand why people chose to live in hard places. Behind them from inside the house came the sound of Thomas, who was 2.5 years old and in possession of an energy that defied all known explanations, evidently doing something that required a leaner, who was not yet one, to express an opinion about it at volume. They both looked over their shoulders toward the source of the noise. Joseph said, "I should probably go see what that is." "Probably," Etta agreed. He went inside. She heard his voice, low and unhurried, saying whatever it was he said to the children when they needed managing, and the sound of Thomas's protest, and then laughter, small and sudden, the child variety which was the most physically real expression of joy she knew. She turned back to the valley. She thought about October of 1878, the first time she had ridden up this path. The way the cottonwoods had been yellow. The way he had stood on the porch. The way she had been so certain she was only here for school business and would not be manufacturing reasons to come back. She had stayed for supper. She was still there. Come spring she had still been there. And come the following spring. And all the springs after that. Building a life that was solid and real and specific in all the ways that mattered. In the particular texture of mornings, and the weight of small hands, and the quality of a silence shared with someone you trusted entirely. In the work of the school, and the work of the land, and the ongoing work of being honest with yourself, and with another person about what you needed and feared and wanted. It was not a life without difficulty. It was not a life without grief or worry, or the occasional dark afternoon, when the weight of things was real and heavy. It was a life, actual and complete, made of all the things that lives are made of. But it was also, underneath all of that and threading through all of it, a love story. The simplest and most unlikely kind. Two people who were both very careful and both very afraid, and who had each been hurt before in ways that had taught them to hold their best selves at a certain distance from the possibility of loss. Who had come together over something practical, a list of school supplies, and had found in each other something much larger, a person whose presence made the world feel more real rather than less, whose company made silence comfortable, whose directness made honesty easy, whose love, when it came without conditions or hidden costs. Years later, when Thomas was old enough to ask his parents how they had met, Etta would tell him the story and Joseph would add the pieces she left out, and Thomas would listen with the expression of a young person encountering the improbability of the fact that they exist at all. And Alina would sit beside him and listen and say, when they were finished, with the decisive clarity she had been born with, "So she stayed because of supper." "She stayed because of supper," Joseph said, looking at Etta. "I stayed because of supper," Etta agreed. "And then I stayed because it was cold, and then I stayed because of the blizzard, and then I stayed because your father asked me to." "And then she stayed because she wanted to," Joseph said. Thomas looked at them both. "That is a strange way for a story to happen," he said. "Most of the real ones are," Etta said. Outside the ranch house, the valley was doing what the Montana Valley did in the particular season they happened to be living in, which was to say it was being itself, immense and various and indifferent to human arrangements, and also, in some way that could not be explained but only felt, entirely hospitable to them. The mountains were where they had always been. The creek ran under the cottonwoods along the back fence. The horses were in the pasture and the cattle were in the north field, and Rufus, who was 67 now and had announced no intention of stopping work, was somewhere nearby doing something useful. Joseph reached across the table and touched the back of Etta's hand, the same brief, deliberate touch that had been part of their language for years, the one that meant simply, "I know, I am here, I am glad." She turned her hand over and held his. Outside, the spring light was moving across the valley in the way it did, slow and golden, making everything it touched look like a thing worth keeping. She was still there. She was going to stay.